almost all the beliefs in our industry is mythology. I would say listening is essential and measurement is very helpful, but both can be done very badly.
Hola, bienvenidos nuevamente a nuestro canal. Hoy es un día muy especial porque nos acompaña el señor Roy Gandy, fundador e ingeniero en tornamesas a cargo de la marca Rega Research, una de nuestras marcas favoritas, ustedes lo saben, con quienes trabajamos hace más de 10 años. Hoy Roy va a contestar algunas preguntas que hemos hecho. Nos ha costado mucho decidir qué preguntas vamos a hacerle, pero él muy amablemente nos ha venido a visitar y estamos muy emocionados de poder compartir este contenido con ustedes. Roy, para partir me encantaría que nos pudieras contar respecto a los inicios de Rega. ¿Cómo comenzaron y cuál era tu visión en ese entonces? Como un joven ingeniero mecánico, ¿cómo fue el desarrollo de la empresa en los primeros días?
Well, first of all, it's my pleasure to be here. I don't think I've seen quite such a pretty city. Maybe Vancouver, but I can't think of another city with so much beauty that I've seen this morning. And with regard to Riga, it's such a long story that we had to write a book, so very difficult to summarize in a short time. But I think the most important thing is that I've always been an unwilling business person, and it's been other people who've been pushing and driving the company. Right from the very beginning, I had a partner for the first 2 or 3 years, and it was his idea to form a limited company to start making the turntables. And looking back, what I have done is what the captain of a ship does. I've just steered it a little bit. And what I've done is definitely not what I would want to do. A lot of people in Riga think that my opinions are what I like, what I want. What I do is look at the company and look at the people, look at what's happening, and make decisions about what is very important for its own character. And the only controversy that we sometimes have in Riga is the fact that it's a very small niche and quite unusual, almost unique, and that we question everything. And we tend to find that almost everything we question within our company is mythology, and so we then decide to do things in a different way. And there are a few people who want to bring it back to competing with other companies and doing normal things. So my biggest job throughout the years has been trying to keep our niche. I think that's the easiest way to explain Riga in a short time.
Y respecto a la metodología de cuestionar todo y hacerlo por ustedes mismos, es que justamente te quería preguntar por qué es tan importante para Rega hacer las cosas in-house y también trabajar con proveedores principalmente locales que están en las cercanías.
Yes, that's an interesting question, because almost everyone assumes that we are very, very patriotic, and made in Britain is something that is looked on with respect worldwide, and they assume that we love our country and therefore we want to make sure everything is done in our own country. There's almost none of that motivation. The real motivation for making everything in England is because we can work with suppliers as people, face to face. If you're trying to make things that are special, that are pushing the boundaries, in our case with engineering, It's trying to get engineering tolerances and fits and materials that are unusual, that are more highly technological than normal, but we're also trying to get them at a lower cost. So we are pushing what people believe, and many companies don't like that. They just tell us they can't do what we want. But there's always a few people who take something difficult as a challenge. And the wonderful thing about Riga is that over the years, mainly in England, but also at the moment in Germany, for instance, there are companies which are using our own unusual technology and our unusual questioning as a challenge for themselves. We work with a company in Germany that has a sales turnover of 1 billion a year. And they developed a product for us that took 5 years of their own development time. And all the time I was telling them, why bother? It's impossible what you want to do. I didn't cooperate myself. Actually, another person in Riga kept driving it. I kept telling him he was wasting his time. But at the end of 5 years, they actually achieved what they wanted to do. I look at it and think, why did they do that? Because the amount of money they've spent will never be justified by the sales they get from Riga. But then they tell me that the increase in technological advantage that they have has helped enormously with much bigger clients that they have, and the ability to make and mold plastics in a much more accurate way with much harder, more friction has helped their company enormously. So they are not people who are looking just at the immediate future, they're looking at the wider picture of someone who can challenge them and meeting the challenge. And they're the people we love working with, and it just gives me enormous feeling of wonderment that there are people like this in the world, and I've been privileged, lucky enough to have worked with 5 or 10 of them over my life. They need to be local if possible, so that's why we have to make everything, if possible, in England.
Y mencionaste dos conceptos que son muy interesantes, que son empujar los límites y lidiar con el desafío para hacer cosas nuevas que están en los bordes, digamos, de la innovación. Respecto a eso, tenemos, una tornamesa tuya, aquí, la Rega P10, y nosotros recibimos muchas consultas respecto a por qué una tornamesa Rega luce así, probablemente muy distinta a lo que hacen otros manufacturadores. ¿Quién mejor que Roy Gandy para comentarnos cuáles han sido, digamos, los desafíos que han tenido en este diseño y de qué manera han empujado la barrera para hacer una tornamesa como esta?
Most challenging thing at the beginning was what almost all the beliefs in our industry is mythology. Nearly all the beliefs, nearly all of the technical parameters that customers are told in magazines about hi-fi are completely mythical. And I discovered this as a young person trying to make my own turntable. And I had no money, but some friends gave me some parts of turntables. And this was at the time when LPs were changing from mono to stereo. And the mono groove on an LP is lateral, but the stereo grooves are vertical, two grooves at right angles giving a vertical movement. And so all the turntables at the time produced a lot of noise and hum, but because the music was horizontal and the noise was vertical, the cartridges did not pick up the noises and hum from the turntable. But as soon as we started to play stereo, we started to pick up the noise from motors and bearings, etc. And by this time I was already not an experienced engineer, but an engineer with a lot of experience. I had built my own motorcycle. I'd built my own bicycles as a kid, then built my own motorcycles, built my own cars. So it was very easy for me to learn that you could make something yourself, you could have a theory, and it would go wrong. If you have a car, and in my case I was doing a lot of rally driving, what's important is the car handles well, it is faster, expect it to go faster, and it might actually go slower. So I was very used to, I wouldn't call it failure, but making mistakes in engineering and then learning from that. When people in the hi-fi industry do things themselves, they're often people who haven't had a lot of experience with building their houses or putting shelves or plumbing, and because they've done it themselves, there's a very strong impulse to believe that the sound has improved because it's changed. I grew up knowing that if I did something, the car was faster, or the motorbike was faster, or it handled well, or it didn't. It's constructive to have a race. You actually know if you've won or not, or if you're faster or slower. And as an engineer, you become very used to something going wrong. And so, as a naive young engineer getting into hi-fi, I followed all of the concepts, for instance, that the plinth should be quite heavy. Getting back to noise, the first thing I ever noticed from a turntable I built was lots of noise. And the noise I noticed came from the motor as a hum and from the bearing as a rumbling noise. So I listened to what the magazines told me. They said if the bass is very, very heavy, everything will work much better. So this story is in our book. I took the turntable apart, turned over the bass, and I glued wet concrete to the underneath of the bass, left it for 3 days to dry, turned it back, assembled it again. And in those days I used to get very excited about what I expected the sound quality to change. And on this occasion, the hum actually got worse. So I'm immediately back into being an engineer and thinking, there's something wrong here, what I've been told is wrong. Of course, now what happens if I go the other way and make it lighter? And then it became obvious when I made it lighter, the hum actually got improved. And it's a normal engineering concept. If something has energy within it, and in this case the energy is noise, and it's very heavy, it has the ability to put more noise into something else. If it's quite light, it doesn't have the ability to transfer that energy because it doesn't have the mass behind it. So this is very, very logical and obvious to any engineer, but in our world there is still this incredible mythology that the turntable base needs to be made from granite or solid aluminium or solid steel or whatever. It took us many years to overcome the resistance, and there's still only copies of Rega now which are making slimmer bases. Most of the big expensive turntables still have huge, enormous, heavy, multi-layered bases, and we're happy, I guess, because we don't have competitors. And after about 40 years of being in business, people started to tell us that we've proved our engineering. Even though we didn't need to prove it to the engineers, we had to prove it to the hi-fi world, and we've proved it with much better sound quality at much lower costs, which makes us feel good. We're doing something genuine. It's taken a lot of effort to get it over to the public, but it also makes us feel good that there are many people all over the world that can actually hear what we're doing, and they're also interested in hearing it. It's not everyone. There's still 90+% of people in the world who are quite happy to hear music on their phone through earbuds, or even just on their phone while they're cooking in the kitchen on a tablet or something. But there's a few people who care about good wine you have in Chile, good food, good coffee, beautiful flowers, people who discriminate. It's not many. I've always assumed it was everyone, but it's actually not many people who are obsessive about these little small differences that can make you happy. But it exists within our world of reproduced music. There are maybe 0.5% of people that really get extra enjoyment from better sound quality. And we're just happy that those are the people who now have come to recognize Riga.
Y respecto a esos pequeños detalles que tú mencionas, yo tengo una debilidad por los brazos que ustedes han diseñado, porque mezclan la complejidad en la manufactura y en el diseño, pero con la simpleza para el usuario, que es algo muy raro en el hi-fi. ¿Qué nos podrías decir de los diseños de los brazos de sus tornamesas?
Yes, actually it was the last design that I did on my own when the company was quite small, 1980 to 82.
The RV300?
Yes. After that, I've always worked with other people, initially with one person and now with teams of people when we're designing things. And I much enjoy the team approach to design. If you're making things on your own, it will never be as good as if you have a group of good people working together and collaborating. But yes, the arm was the last thing I designed on my own by myself. The various different models have become the result of working with other people, changing, improving the quality, or actually making a cheaper version. I know what you're trying to do is to get me to give you the whole design methodology in 5 or 10 words. This has happened all my life. People come to Riga and they look at what we're doing and they say, this is amazing, why don't you tell people? Why don't you write a leaflet? And I've always said it will take a book. And so it will take a whole day for me to go into every detail of the arm. But I can try and condense it into a philosophy that Riga has that nobody else in our industry has. They all see a turntable as just something that needs to go round at what they say is a constant speed without analysing what constant means. And they think it doesn't need to make much noise, and then you have a turntable. What we noticed very, very early on was that the turntable is actually a machine for measuring vibration. And the only similarity is something that measures earthquakes. And it does it in an incredibly different way. And when I wrote the book, I investigated the equipment for measuring earthquakes, and I tried to look into seismology, the science of earthquake measurement, and I was surprised about how simple it is and how naive it is. Maybe in another 10 years I'll get into measuring earthquakes.
Okay.
Because the way it's done is, to me, very, very amateurish. But also a turntable is the same thing. To measure the vibration in an LP, you have to measure at up to 20,000 cycles per second, a vibration that can be down to 1 micron. A micron is a thousandth of a millimeter or a millionth of a meter. To put it into perspective, a human hair, the thinnest human hairs are about 20 microns. And we measured some recently. We measured a whole group of people at Riga, and their hairs were measuring between 20 and 50 microns. So a turntable has to measure much less than a human hair. And in order to measure something this small, the movement within the measuring machine should be much less than the movement that you're trying to measure. And the problem with a turntable structurally is it has to have more movement than the movement you're trying to measure. So we can, as engineers, just say it can't work. It's not measuring it very accurately. And all we can do is try to make everything measure a little bit better, which means taking away play in everything. So the arm will have bearings which have to move in all directions. There will be movement in the bearings. In Riga arms, we take away any play in the bearing. The turntable has to rotate. In order to rotate, it has to have a bearing and there has to be some movement. Otherwise it would be stuck, it would be stiff. So there is an inevitable amount of movement happening, as well as the materials themselves are able to compress much more than 1 or 2 microns. If you take a tube of any material the length of an arm and just push it with your fingers, you will be able to compress it by a few microns, anything from 5 to 20 microns depending on the material. So as an engineer we just say it can't work, but what we can do is try to improve it by making everything stiffer, taking away any joints which can move slightly, taking away steps in the material which concentrate stress, taking away inbuilt stress in the turntable which creates natural frequencies which allows the turntable to vibrate more at a natural frequency. These are all very, very normal standard engineering concepts that any mechanical engineer will understand, but just unfortunately are not understood in our industry. We discovered very early on that there is a proper science surrounding loudspeakers. You can go on the internet now and download very easily an app on how to make a loudspeaker, and the chances are, if you do that and follow it, you'll probably make a better loudspeaker than most commercial speakers, because you don't have the problem of money. You can buy drive units, you don't have to worry how much it's costing. With electronics, there are thousands of papers that have been written over the years. We have 2 pallet loads alone just at Riga in magazines. But if you try and research turntable design, there's almost nothing. There's no books, there's no leaflets. There's some papers written by Shaw about cartridge tracking. There's a paper that was done by the Cranfield University in England that was sponsored by a turntable manufacturer, and they investigated the concept of damping in a turntable, which again is completely mythological and misstated, but a guy got his degree doing it, and that's it. There are no books, no papers on turntable design. AR decided that it was a good idea to be quite stiff between the bearing and the tone arm, which is something that we've taken to an extreme. But that's it. But to summarize, it's about stiffness and lightness and lack of movement.
Te quería preguntar, Roy, ya que estamos hablando mucho de la manera de medir los equipos de audio tienen una característica que, claro, tienen que medir para poder hacer más de una unidad y que den los mismos resultados. Una es la parte más científica de la medición, pero por otro lado tenemos que escucharlos. para saber que nos puedan entregar lo que estamos buscando. ¿Qué nos puedes decir del balance entre esos dos ámbitos? La parte más de la medición científica versus la parte de la percepción o la escucha de la música a través de los equipos.
I think what you're talking about is the controversy between listening and measurement. And it's not a very easy question to answer because both are important. I would say listening is essential and measurement is very helpful, but both are controversial, both can be done very badly. It's very, very difficult for somebody who designs something and makes something to listen to it objectively. I was talking about this before. Normally if you make something yourself and you listen, it will sound good. You have to have had a history of making mistakes and failure to be able to accept if you do something and it doesn't sound as good. When I started in the business, I had already had a mother who was, I found out after she died, an excellent concert pianist. And one of the reasons she became qualified is she was able to perform emotionally. And other people who were with her and were actually technically better than her failed the final performance exam. And she got angry with the examiners because she told them, they're better than me. Why did they fail and I passed? She actually got angry with them. This was my mother. And they said, calm down, calm down. We understand you made some mistakes, but a performer needs to express their emotion. The difference between a performer is someone that can put their emotion into the music, not just play the notes. That's why we passed you. And maybe that's why, I don't know, but I've always listened to the emotion in music. I've always marveled at the fact that when music is recorded, almost all of the wonderful singers, the wonderful guitarists, the amazing trumpet, saxophone players, the ability that they have when you hear them live tends to get lost when it's recorded. Sometimes all of it. So the short story is that Riga, when we listen to music, we listen to the performance. We listen to performers that we love. We listen to special recordings that have captured some of the performance, some of that special thing that special performance can do, and then we try to discern how much of that is coming out in the equipment, whether it's an amplifier, a loudspeaker, or a turntable. And there is a very big difference between turntables and loudspeakers with amplifiers in the middle. If a turntable is performing better, it just takes more information off the record. It's not really a matter of opinion. So we're lucky if we can take more of that vibrational measurement off the record, but the obvious thing about a turntable is you just get more music. With a loudspeaker, it's reproducing what the turntable and the amplifier feed into it. And because all of this whole process is not very perfect, it's like looking at a photograph that has the colors enhanced a little more, can be more pleasant to look at. And with sound, when the sound is enhanced a little bit more by the loudspeaker, it can be more pleasurable for some people. So there is a lot of area of opinion in a loudspeaker, and it's totally valid, I believe. In a turntable, we're lucky, we produce more information, and after 50 years of making turntables, more and more people are able to hear this, and Riga has become more and more successful because of it. And if you use your skills that are very unusual and they're against everyone else's beliefs, and using those skills makes you successful, it makes the people in the company feel good.
Respecto a lo que mencionas de la escucha emocional de tus productos, no puedo no preguntarte por los productos de Rega que más te han emocionado. Quizás nos puedes contar alguna anécdota de algún desarrollo o de algún producto en específico que no solo te haya llamado la atención o te haya hecho estar orgulloso, sino que realmente te haya emocionado.
I think almost every piece of equipment at Riga has many stories, but one story that really appeals to me is about our electronics engineer, Terry Bateman. In the 1980s, he had proved that he could develop and get a design working that was done by someone else, but the designer couldn't make it work properly. All I could hear was there was the potential of excellent sound quality, and I had always vowed, I'd always said, Riga will never make electronic equipment because the problems are enormous. We knew intimately other companies at the time, like Name Audio, like Arcam, and there were many other companies who went broke because their equipment was unreliable and kept breaking. And I just looked at any amplifier and saw there were a few hundred components that we had no control over. So you can imagine I was saying, no, never. Yeah. Until somebody came along with, I think 700 or 800 components all fixed together with wires. And he said, would you listen? And we listened. And it sounded exceptionally good, except there was some hum. And also some smoke.
Smoke too, yeah.
Coming off the particular resistors. And then, because of the good sound quality, I couldn't let it go. And we asked the designer, we even gave him a budget to develop it. And at the end of a year, he couldn't improve it. And that's when we met Terry, a local producer of printed circuit boards, said, I know someone who, if anyone can make something work, it's him. And we met Terry, and he looked at the circuit, and he actually recognized two designers that were involved just by looking at the components and the wires. And he immediately got very excited, and he said, whoa, this is the cream of circuit technology. Wow, how have you come across this? I'd love to be involved in something like this. And we tried to explain that it's been a year in development with the designer. And the designer had some humility, and he said, this is my dream, but I'm not a good designer, I'm not experienced. And we then realized that Terry really wanted to get his hands on it, and he wanted to play with it. And we said, do you want to take it away? And he was shocked. He couldn't believe we would let him take it. And after he got over the shock and yeah, I'll look at it. It was his dream. And 2 weeks later he came back and he'd put it, and the smoking had stopped and the hum had stopped, and it was sounding beautiful. And that's how we first met Terry. And many years later, he and another person at Riga were visiting a second-hand measuring equipment company, because back then we couldn't afford new pieces of equipment. And they wanted to buy a scope, and they went and visited the company in an old Escort car, but the company didn't have the scope they wanted. but Terry had disappeared, and they were trying to find him in this warehouse of equipment, and they eventually found him looking at 2 big pallets. Each pallet is more than a cubic meter of electronic articles. And the guy with him, Phil, was saying, "Come on, Terry, we've got to go now." And Terry was saying, I can't go, I can't leave these. And Phil was saying, "Well, we've got to go. What do you mean you can't go?" And Terry was just saying, no, he was almost shaking. I've got to have these. And they'd been there for some years and they were very cheap, so Phil negotiated the cost with the owner. The problem was getting them in the car. 2 pallet loads of 1 meter high magazines and papers. They were the Acoustic Engineering Society papers and magazines. They weighed maybe half a ton, maybe a little more, but they managed to take them out and fit them into the car, some in the boot, some on the front, some actually under the driver's seat. And poor old Terry was sitting like this in the back with all of his magazines around him. They had to use the wing mirrors because they couldn't see out the back. And the suspension was actually right down on the rubber stops. There was no suspension left in the car, and they had to drive 100 miles back like this. And then what was unbelievable is Terry read his way through every single magazine and every single article. And what we've since discovered, he's got a sort of photographic memory for technical things. And many, many years later, when we decided we wanted a new Brio, Terry had remembered an article that came from 1969 and 1970. And the Riga brief was, we want a new Brio, it's got to be the same cost, it's got to sound the same, but it must have a remote control and it mustn't cost any more. And so all of us just said, it's not possible because the remote control in an analog form will add nearly £100 to the item. And Terry then cleverly realized he could convert the old Brio into surface mount. We could then put it into a case that was half the size, and the case itself would reduce the cost almost as much as the volume, the remote control would cost. The only problem at the time was there were other manufacturers producing these small equipment and they weren't very commercially successful. But it was the only way we could meet the brief. So Terry sat down. Within 2 or 3 weeks, he'd finished the article, he'd finished the brief, he'd designed the old Brio into surface mount, and he had it in a small case. And at that point, I was the only person that used to do the listening. I was much younger, my ears were better. And we had the formal listen. I was shocked, it sounded exactly the same as the old Brio. And I said, wow, Terry, well done, this is amazing. It was so quick also. And then Terry got a bit agitated and he said, I've got something else for you to listen to. And then I realized he always did this. He's one of those few engineers that never had one result. If you asked him and gave him a brief, he'd always come up. Sometimes he came up with 5 alternatives. But in this occasion, he had 1 alternative. And he said, could you have a listen to this? And it was another small case, same size, with some wires poking out the top. It didn't have it. And he brought it in. And he played a disc on it that I was a bit surprised. It was James Taylor. And Terry is a heavy metal fanatic. He loves Van Halen, he loves ZZ Top. And he played it, and it sounded much, much better than the new Brio that he'd produced. almost holographic. And I recognized it as the type of sound you get from a very good valve amplifier. And Terry has always loved valve amplifiers. He's always wanted us to make one, but it's never been commercially viable. Even back then at Rega, it wasn't commercially viable because the sales quantity is not enough for Rega. And I just said to Terry, it just came out, how have you done that? It sounds beautiful. And then I suddenly realized he's managed to make a small valve amplifier, and he's trying to pretend that it can fit into a small case, and maybe this is something we should make. And then I realized, why is he playing James Taylor, which is just a man and a guitar? And if any of you've listened to lots of valve amplifiers, they can sound good, but when the music gets more complicated, they get more messy and more muddled. If there's any generalization about the sound of valve amplifiers, the good ones can sound a little better when it's something simple. I don't think I've ever heard a better valve amplifier with more complex music. And I suddenly realized, Terry's pulling a little trick here. And he often used to do a demonstration with a CD that was Jackson Browne. And it wasn't the usual Jackson Browne piano and singer. It was heavily produced. It was a very, very poor quality recording with lots of compression. And I thought, this is the way to show him that the amplifier isn't that good. I said, have you got your Jackson Browne CD? And Terry said, oh yes, I've got it in the car. And he went out, brought it back, and we played that, and it sounded even better. And I just said, Terry, how have you done that with a valve amplifier? And he looked shocked. He said, it's not a valve amplifier, it's just something I've been working on. And that was history, actually. The other story was that at that point I was the next day going to do a 1-month trip to the Far East. But I then said, you can't do the new Brio, Terry, you've got to work on this one. It's so much better. And Terry was so happy. One of the few times that he'd worked with me and went away smiling and jumping and almost dancing. And so I went on my trip, came back expecting to see this pile of wires in a small box, well into production, and Terry was looking depressed. And I said, oh, Terry, how's it? And he said, I couldn't do it because everyone at Rega said I mustn't change the sound of the old Brio. And I went, oh no. And I said, but have they listened to this? And he said, no, they just told me I've got to keep it the same as the old Brio because everyone likes it. So my job was getting everyone to do what I'd done, listen to the new one. And as soon as they listened to it, they were just as shocked as me. And it made me feel I'm still needed. And this was the start of our whole new range of electronics. It started the Brio, which you'll know is still now something very small, but people are amazed that the Brio is used in systems. I've got a friend driving big Martin Logan loudspeakers with a little mini Brio. The other day back in Peru, we had an IO, which is the low-powered version of the Brio, working with some Macintosh loudspeakers that said they need 1,000 watts to drive them. And this little 30-watt IO was working and sounding better than the Macintosh, in my opinion, I have to add. And well, everyone that was listening also, they were shocked. So that's the story of a product, how we have a really unusual designer that was able to take what he had read in the 1970s, 69-70, of the possible way of making a transistor work in Class A, but with Class B heat characteristics. And at the time it was only theory. And at the time transistors were quite slow. They were predominantly germanium transistors, and the writer was just philosophizing. And Terry, how many years later? 30 years later, remembered that article, realized that modern transistors were fast enough, realized that one company were making transistors with the driver transistors in the same chip as the power transistors, so this was as close as possible to zero resistance. And he designed his own circuit around the philosophy that was done in the 70s, and that was what the Brio was. And now it's been the new LX and the new Illicit also, and the Ethos. So can you imagine how incredibly proud I am of someone else in Riga having that sort of vision, that creativity, that memory, and the incredible ability to recognize one idea out of thousands and realize how appropriate something else is, and produce products that now are making Riga Electronics as successful as turntables.
Impresionante la historia. Y puedo preguntarte, porque estamos hablando acerca de Terry Bateman.
Yes.
Él también está encargado de la parte de los pre-Phono, porque yo siempre que pruebo la electrónica de Rega sé que va a cumplir. Impresionante lo que cunde, como decimos acá. Pero donde también hay un espacio para impresionarse respecto a los productos que ustedes hacen es en toda la gama de pre-Phono, donde por el presupuesto siempre son no solo muy competitivos, sino que se caracterizan por ser muy abiertos, por ser muy potentes, tener una amplitud de frecuencia muy grande. Terry también está encargado de esa área.
Yes, until recently, everything that we have produced electronically, except for the power supply on the Planet 10 or the P10, has been designed by Terry. The Planet 10 power supply was the first item that another designer worked with Terry, a much younger guy. Terry oversaw it and mentored it and approved it. But now we also, 10 years ago now, we had an American graduate who'd qualified in electronic engineering in America, and he bought a Brio and an Apollo CD player. Being an electronic student, couldn't resist taking it apart, was amazed at the sound quality, and when he looked in it, he couldn't believe how expertly the printed circuit board was laid out, etc. And he called us and said, I want to learn from the guy that designed this. So we have here a young, digitally experienced electronics engineer who wanted to gain the experience of analog design. So we've got this wonderful group of 3 people working together that also makes me very, very proud, because it's always been special teams that produce special things. So, have I answered your question? Every product has a long story, which would take the whole day. But I'm happy with the future of Riga now, because we have these 2 younger people, with Terry slowly retiring. He keeps warning us that he's going to retire, but I don't think he'll ever let go. And Riga definitely has a strong future in electronics now.
No, increíble. Y bueno, para cerrar, Roy, justamente tomando esto que dices de una especie de posta de las nuevas generaciones entrando y aprendiendo a trabajar con los maestros, quienes desarrollaron los productos que hicieron conocidos Riga. ¿Cómo ves tú el panorama del mundo analógico? Quizás tiene más que ver con el mundo de las personas que nos interesamos en sentarnos y escuchar música, pero específicamente, ¿cómo ves tú el panorama del mundo analógico y cómo se complementa con lo digital en las posibilidades?
What do I think? I guess you're asking which sounds better, which is what I normally get asked. When CD first appeared, a vast majority of the hi-fi world, particularly the reviewers, were saying this is much better. And at Riga we were just stunned. I guess we've been used to doing what we wanted, understanding what we wanted, believing in our listening ability, and we've been used to controversy, but we couldn't believe at that time how a large quantity of the world was saying this sounds so much better. Time has shown, I think, luckily, that it lasted for some time, and then people started looking for their LPs again. For whatever reason, there were many, many reasons. And in 2009, there was a dramatic return to LPs and vinyl. And we could talk for hours about why again, but in 2009, our very small production of turntables doubled without us doing anything, and we had to take notice. And at that time we decided to reinvest in turntable manufacture, and that's been wonderful for us because we'd had 40 years of learning how to make turntables, but we'd not had the opportunity to invest because the quantities were so low that the profitability from turntables was not sufficient to invest in design and development. So the upturn in sales in 2009 allowed us to put in huge investment, and since that time you've seen the very unusual designs that have come out of Riga one by one, and each one sounding better than the last, because we're able to develop and experiment with our ideas, because there's more people than just me now. And we have the facilities and the money to actually put into development. And I guess that's made my life pleasurable still. A whole new type of Riga, a larger company with better facilities, not a poor student like I was at the time. Everything had to be made by myself with tiny bits of metal and wood that I could get free of charge. Now at least we can buy advanced materials. We can work with Manchester University on advanced graphene, for instance. We can use titanium in our materials. We can investigate latest technology, materials like basalt and graphene additives to carbon fibre that we've used in the Naya. So, yeah, a naive young engineer that I was at the time, just wanting to make better music, originally just for me. I'm now getting great pleasure using my 50 years of engineering, well, more than that, 70 years of engineering skill into something that gives huge pleasure to other people. And in the last few years, I've only come to realize how much pleasure it's giving.
Bueno, Roy, fue una conversación muy interesante y muy emocionante escuchar la manera en que has construido esta empresa, obviamente haciendo hincapié en la calidad del grupo humano. Yo he tenido la suerte de visitarlos 2 veces y en realidad desde el momento en que uno entra a la fábrica se entiende mucho mejor por qué logran hacer productos de tan buena calidad y tan conectados también con una audiencia. Así que, thank you very much. Y a toda nuestra audiencia, quienes nos están viendo, si les interesó esta entrevista y quieren conocer más acerca de las marcas y que profundicemos respecto a los productos, no olviden suscribirse, darle like y compartir este contenido con las personas que puedan estar interesadas. Así que hasta la próxima. See you soon, Roy.
Muchas gracias. Muchas gracias.